Whenever a wrestler manages to find success in the industry, it can be something which comes at the end of a lengthy road of struggle. And for that reason then, they no doubt want the success to last for as long as possible. Sometimes though, it only lasts for a short while, long enough to label them as a one-hit wonder of sorts. But who are the biggest examples of this phenomenon? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Fandango, and the time he beat Chris Jericho at WrestleMania. Yes, back in 2019, Chris Jericho was already a legend of the industry, someone whose resume spoke for itself. And that's why, even if he was starting to enter the elder statesman part of his career by then, a win over him was still seen as a big deal. So as you would expect, wins over Y2J didn't come too often, and when they did, they usually happened to someone who was getting a big push. Seriously, the idea that a mid-card comedy act would come in during their first match and pin Jericho seemed outrageous. But that's exactly what took place at WrestleMania 29 when Fandango stepped up to the plate. Who was Fandango? Well, he was a ballroom dancer gimmick portrayed by journeyman performer Johnny Curtis. Needless to say then, this was not a character many had pegged for main event success. No, if anything, the assumption was he'd be in the Santino Marella role of undercard guy who could get fans invested in some funny goings-on. But Vince McMahon clearly had a different idea here. And that idea was to make a star out of Fandango, which was exactly why, when he challenged Jericho at the Showcase of the Immortals, he'd shock the world by pinning him clean in under 10 minutes. That's right, it was the upset of the year, and one which quickly catapulted the rookie onto greater fame. Of course, it isn't just his big Mania win which did that for him though. No, it was also the fact that his theme song got hugely over as a viral meme with fans, with it even rising pretty high in the UK singles charts. But if anyone thought this was going to lead to a long-term push for the main native, they'd be wrong because, as with all memes, the shelf life was ultimately pretty short for this one. So because of that, by the time WrestleMania 30 came around, Fandango would be relegated to being a warm body in the Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal, a far cry from beating the first ever undisputed champion only 12 months previously. But even if it was short, it was still a hell of a run on top for the ballroom dancer while it lasted. And this wouldn't be the only time Chris Jericho would be involved in giving a wrestler a short-lived run of success. No, the same thing would happen a few years later when he was beaten by Action Andretti. Yes, let's move over to All Elite Wrestling for this one, as that's where Chris Jericho has been plying his craft ever since their creation in 2019, with him helping to establish the company back then as its inaugural world champion. Obviously, given how big of a star Jericho has been over his career, he never needed to leave the main event scene behind. No, he could have stayed up there with the Jon Moxleys and the Kenny Omegas of the world right up until the point he retired, but seeing he was better off playing the gatekeeper to the next generation after a while, he began slipping into more of an upper mid-card role around 2023. Who would he put over as part of this new role on the show? Well, many people. People like Ricky Starks, Hook, and Bandito, just to name a few. But none of these were as shocking as the time he took a jobber by the name of Action Andretti and, in his first televised match with AEW, laid down for him clean. Yes, if there was a 21st century version of the 1-2-3 Kid beating Razor Ramon, then this was it. And it instantly rocketed Andretti up the card, at least for a little while, as he began looking like a future player. Unfortunately though, once it became apparent the Philadelphia native was still too green to be put anywhere near the top of the card on a long-term basis, his brief dalliance with stardom would come to an end. But that doesn't mean he's gone from AEW altogether. No, he still works there today, now in the role of mid-card tag team act alongside Lio Rush. Will he ever get that spotlight again? It's possible, but even if he doesn't, he'll always have that night when he shocked the world by beating Chris Jericho live on Dynamite. Well, let's move away from AEW for now and over to the company we mentioned a moment ago, the one which they serve as a spiritual successor to in many ways, WCW. And the reason we're moving there is because it's where our next subject had his own short run of success. That's right, it's time for us to talk about Blitzkrieg. Don't remember Blitzkrieg? A lot of people don't these days, to be fair. But for a moment in time there, back when World Championship Wrestling was still riding high in 1999, he got a surprising push up the card. No, he was never challenging Goldberg for the world title, and he was never locked into a feud with Hulk Hogan or Sting, but what he would get would be a strong, focused-upon position within the jewel in that company's crown, the Cruiserweight division. Yes, while the NWO angle might have been the thing that took Ted Turner's promotion to its greatest successes, and while Ric Flair might have been their undisputed ace, those who were watching WCW back in the day knew the real highlight to almost any episode of Nitro was when the Cruiserweights came out. After all, this was the division that first introduced so many fans to the likes of Rey Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero, Chris Jericho, and more. And in 1999, there was one more name who was added to that list, a name which surprised many: Blitzkrieg. Why was this so surprising? Well, because Blitzkrieg was still a rookie here, and while he was good, he was being thrown right into the deep end with some of the best wrestlers in the world. Luckily then, he proved to be able to hold his own here, so much so that after having early standout bouts against Juventud Guerrera, Billy Kidman, and Dean Malenko, he'd find himself coming within arm's length of the Cruiserweight title. In the end though, despite challenging for this belt on multiple occasions throughout the year, Blitzkrieg would not be able to win it. And what's more, come October of 1999, he'd be gone from not just WCW, but wrestling altogether. Why was this? Well, he wanted to take up a new career as a computer programmer, and this necessitated him hanging up his boots for good. As you can expect then, there were no further appearances for the Californian in World Championship Wrestling following that, and this meant that when you looked at his run of success, it can't be thought of as anything but short. Still though, for as short as it was, he certainly packed a lot in there while he was around, and had he stuck around much longer, we've no doubt he would have ended up getting that elusive Cruiserweight title win, even if he'd have to have wrestled during WCW 2000 in order to achieve this. Will we ever see Blitzkrieg return at this point? It's unlikely, as he appears to be happy with his life as it is today. So let's move away from him for now, and over to our next subject instead, another short-lived success story in wrestling, the Ultimate Warrior and his run as WWF Champion. Yes, we know that considering the Ultimate Warrior to be a short-term success overall might seem wild, as he was a big star for quite a few years there during the late 80s and right into the mid-90s. But while he was a regular presence in wrestling throughout this period, he never managed to stay on top of the mountain for long. No, as far as world title runs, this would very much be a short-term thing for Jim Hellwig, as his only opportunity to call himself the man came in WWF in 1990. What happened there? Well, that was when he challenged Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 6 and pinned him clean in the middle of the ring, in the process becoming not only the WWF champion, but also the Intercontinental champion too. As you would expect then, this was supposed to be the start of a lengthy run as him being the successor to the Hulkster, the new face of the company. But as would quickly become apparent, Warrior was not drawing at the box office in the same way that Hogan had. So because of this, by the time January of 1991 came around, the decision would be to take the belt off of the Warrior, with this being what happened at that year's Royal Rumble. That's right, after less than a year and only one pay-per-view main event title defense, the Ultimate Warrior as champion experiment was over, and once it was, continued backstage issues would ensure that he never got that belt again. So while he would continue to be a star for some years to come, his run as champion can't really be considered anything less than short-term. Could it have been different? Maybe if Hulk Hogan had been away for a while and not taking up all the oxygen in the room throughout 1990, then it could have worked out better. But this wouldn't be the last time Vince McMahon thought he'd found a replacement for the Hulkster only for this to fall apart. No, the same thing would also happen with our next one-hit wonder of a subject, Tom McGee. Yeah, there was a period where McGee was a key element in wrestling's great holy grail. Basically, the story to this one is that back in 1986, McGee would get a tryout match with WWF at a television taping in Rochester, New York, with him here going up against Bret Hitman Hart. Of course, with him being a bodybuilder and having a great physique, the hope was that if he could have a good match, this would be the next top star Vince McMahon was looking for. And wouldn't you know it, he would indeed blow people away in the ring this evening. So once the boss got to see the tape of the bout, he suddenly had stars in his eyes and began making plans to present the Winnipeg native as his new ace, with the plan being that he would take over Hulk Hogan's role. But any plans of this nature would soon dissipate when subsequent house show matches involving McGee showed him to be a lot greener than people had realized. Really, it was puzzling. After all, he'd been so good when he went up against the excellence of execution. So what had happened? Had he really regressed that much, that quickly? Well, the answer to that was no. Rather, McGee had never been that great at all. In fact, the reason he looked like such a star in the first place was because he was in the ring with Bret Hart, one of the greatest of all time. Yes, so good was the Hitman at this point, he probably could have carried anyone to a 4-star bout. And this meant he'd accidentally been able to make a rookie look like the second coming of Shawn Michaels. Obviously then, once everyone figured out what had happened, plans to push Tom McGee to the moon were put on ice, and his short run on top was over just as quickly as it had begun. And as for the match itself, well, this would become a piece of lost media for years, with it only being rediscovered again in 2019. But what about Bret Hart? How would his career go after this? Well, WWF would realize they really did have their next star in the ring during that famous bout. They'd just been looking in the wrong corner was all. So it was then that by the time the mid-90s came around, the Hitman would be the top guy in WWF for a while, with him becoming a 5-time WWF champion by the time all was said and done. Hell, he'd even be there through the dark times to give the company a boost, times like when our next subject, Lawrence Taylor, had his own brief run of success by main eventing WrestleMania against Bam Bam Bigelow. Now, we should clarify, when we say Lawrence Taylor only had a brief run of success, we're talking specifically about his time in wrestling. Yes, we're well aware that on the gridiron he had a very lengthy spell as a superstar, what with him spending 12 years playing as linebacker for the New York Giants. But once his football career came to an end in 1993, he began looking for some new challenges that would ultimately see him enter the squared circle. That's right, it was in the spring of 1995, right when WWF was arguably at their lowest point ever and in desperate need of something which would kickstart public interest once more, that they decided to bring in LT for a celebrity angle. But not just any celebrity angle, no, one which would result in the football player main eventing the biggest show of the year. Sure, it couldn't have made Shawn Michaels and Diesel happy to see their world title bout get bumped from the spot, but with things the way they were, Vince McMahon felt like this was the only option he had if he wanted to get people to buy the show in large numbers. So now that this was decided upon, the next step was to find a challenger for Taylor, someone who could come across as legitimate, be a safe pair of hands for someone who'd never wrestled before, and also be convinced to lose the match. And in the end, the man who best fit the bill for all three of these categories was Bam Bam Bigelow. Yes, the WrestleMania 12 closer would now be Lawrence Taylor versus the Beast from the East, with the whole thing first being teased at the 1995 Royal Rumble. How would the match itself go? Well, it wasn't a Matt Classic by any means. It did the job in the sense that LT was able to be carried for 12 minutes and was able to get the win in the end. So after it was over, it was very much a case of mission accomplished. But partially because it didn't exactly do big business at the box office, and partially because Taylor didn't appear to have any desire to step into the ring for a second time, his run on top would come to a very abrupt end here. Obviously then, this has to rank as both one of the shortest and most successful runs on top because while it only amounted to one match, that one match was the main event of WrestleMania. Of course, this wouldn't be the only time someone had a short run, pretty much entirely centered around the showcase of the Immortals though. No, while our next subject, Nicholas, wouldn't main event the show in 2018, he would win a title there when he had his one and only match to date by teaming up with Braun Strowman to defeat The Bar. Yes, this one actually happened, and it all happened relatively recently, all things considered. It all started back in the lead up to WrestleMania 34. Braun Strowman had his sights set on the Raw Tag Team titles, which were then being held by the duo made up of Sheamus and Cesaro. But with him not having a tag team partner, Red Brand General Manager Kurt Angle wouldn't let the Monster Among Men go it alone. No, if he wanted a challenge for the gold, then he'd have to find somebody to team up with. The only problem was, come the night of WrestleMania itself, Braun still didn't have a second. And so that was why he chose to go into the crowd here and find a 10-year-old boy named Nicholas, who he hand-selected right there and then. Why was Strowman doing this here? To prove a point mainly, and this point was that he could beat the tag team champions in what was effectively going to be a handicap match. So it was then that just 4 minutes later, Braun Strowman and Nicholas would be holding the gold over their heads, with this technically making him the youngest champion in WWE's long history. But as it happened, he wasn't just some random fan who'd gotten lucky that night. No, he was the son of referee John Cone. Obviously then, given his age, going on the road to defend the tag team titles was not going to be an option, if for no other reason than because he had homework to do. And that was why the next night on Raw, he'd vacate his newly won belt, all with the promise that he'd be back again one day in order to reclaim it. That's right, as runs on top go, this was remarkably short, as it lasted for all of 24 hours. But when we're talking about a 10-year-old boy here, that's very impressive. Come on now, who else his age could say they were able to defeat the Bar? We've no doubt the whole situation made him very popular at school the next week. But he's not the only person who had their brief run of success in WWE centered around a single WrestleMania moment. No, just a few years later, the exact same thing would happen with someone else, a person any turn of the millennium teenager will be all too aware of, someone who goes by the name of Johnny Knoxville and who at WrestleMania 38 had a one-on-one encounter with Sami Zayn. Yes, whether it be as a member of the Jackass crew alongside Steve-O, Chris Pontius, and many others, or in his later film work where he's gone in a more of a solo direction, the Tennessee native have been something of bordering on a household name for decades now. And it wasn't even as if WrestleMania 38 marked his first appearance inside of a wrestling ring. No, he'd already shown up as a guest star for Raw in both 2008 and 2010. But 2022 represented something totally different for him in that this time he was going to have a match. That's right, it was at this point that after getting into a war of words with Sami Zayn, someone who was by then still in his pre-Bloodline affiliation days, and so still a complete comedy character, that the two would decide to settle things in the ring. And this would lead to one of the most ludicrous but funny matches the Showcase of the Immortals has ever seen. Come on now, how many times have we seen a wrestling match involve a giant rubber hand or a human-sized mousetrap? Sure, a lot of the reason it worked was because Sami Zayn helped carry the match, but Johnny Knoxville deserves his flowers too, as it takes two to tango. Hell, his role in the entire proceedings is even more impressive in a way because he's the one who isn't a trained wrestler. Did that mean his moment in the sun at WrestleMania was going to mark the start of a new career for the Knoxville native, much like a Bad Bunny or a Logan Paul? No, Johnny had far too much other stuff going on to commit to WWE for the long haul, so instead, he'd return to the world of movies and TVs, leaving his run of success in the ring to come to an end here. Of course, there's always the chance he does return for another match in the future, or at very least another appearance. And if he does, maybe he'll be able to pick up where he left off and this time go even higher, possibly by getting a rematch against Sami Zayn or even targeting someone else entirely. But this wasn't the only great comedy moment which created a short run of success for a WWE wrestler. No, back in 2014, right at the peak of the PG era, there would be a similar kind of match that happened which allowed at least one of its participants to create a unique moment in history. What are we talking about this time? What else but Hornswoggle and the truly one-of-a-kind WLC match. Yes, this one was the same concept of a TLC match, a match stipulation which involves tables and ladders and chairs, and which has given us at least one of the most iconic bouts in WWE history. But what makes the WLC different? Well, it involved little people fighting it out instead. That's right, this all happened during a pre-show at Extreme Rules in May of 2014. As to who the competitors were, well, they'd be El Torito and Hornswoggle. And sure, Hornswoggle might have already been someone known to fans ever since he was first introduced back in 2006 as the little bastard sidekick of Fit Finlay, but this was really a coming out moment for him as it allowed him a rare opportunity to have a real competitive match where the spotlight was actually on him. Sure, it was a comedy encounter, but like with Sami Zayn and Johnny Knoxville's showdown about a decade later, this one totally worked as all the comedy beats hit just right. And once it was all over, even if Hornswoggle ended up losing the bout, he seemed to be the one who was the most elevated by the whole thing, as he was the person people talked about first when they recounted the spectacle later on. So did this mean Dylan Postal would see a continued wave of success as the months went on? Not exactly. No, once WLC was in the rearview mirror, he'd return to being more of a comedy sidekick, with this being something which continued all the way up until he was released from his contract in 2016. But at least he'll always have that moment where, for one night anyway, he was on top of the world. And that's something which can never be taken away from him, no matter how much time passes and how many different eras come and go. And Hornswoggle isn't the only person from the time period who had a brief moment in the sun when it came to success and stardom. Though in the case of our next subject, his ceiling appeared to be a lot higher at one point, and that's because his name is none other than Ryback. Let's take you all the way back to 2012 if we can. That was the period when Ryback Mania was at its peak. Why was this? Well, after arriving on the scene that spring with a whole new gimmick following the failure of the Nexus, this was where fans would quickly start to fall in love with the big man. And this led to live crowds reacting for him in very positive ways as the months went on and he started rising further up the ranks. Sure, part of it was the whole Goldberg thing, with Ryback's "Feed Me More" catchphrase certainly aping that of Bill's "Who's Next" gimmick from the turn of the millennium, and the fact that they were both big muscle guys also helping to fuel the comparisons. But to call the Las Vegas native nothing more than a Goldberg ripoff would be underselling the appeal he had in 2012. No, there was more to it than that. And this was exactly why, by the time Hell in a Cell came around in October of that year, he'd be challenging CM Punk for the WWE title inside of the titular cage. Would he win the gold here? No. By that point, there was no stopping the train that was Punk's 434-day run as champion. So in the end, Ryback proved to be collateral damage. And this would have a big impact on him going forward as it happened, because now that he'd lost, he just didn't have that same kind of aura anymore. Yes, it was always going to have to be the case that the big man would lose eventually, and when this did happen, he was going to have to rework some things. But because it happened sooner than people were expecting it to, it seemed to cut his legs right out from under him before he had time to recalibrate. Of course, this was never the plan in the first place. No, the only reason Ryback was thrown into that title match against CM Punk so early was because John Cena had gotten injured. But sometimes changes have to be made on the fly in wrestling, and this was a change which would hit the big man hard in the long run. So hard would it hit him, in fact, that despite wrestling Punk again at the 2013 Hell in a Cell pay-per-view, he'd never be on the same level as he once was with fans. And it wouldn't be long after this that he'd pretty much have fallen down to the role of mid-carder again. And after that, it was a quick descent all the way up to the point he was ultimately released from his contract in 2016. But like with Hornswoggle, even if the big guy was released at this point, he would always have that brief moment where he was in the spotlight to look back on. And unlike Hornswoggle, his moment in the sun was more than just a comedy pre-show bout. Rather, it was a spot in the main event scene. But then, whether it's the main event or not, everyone we've looked at today all deserve equal focus for being a true one-hit wonder of wrestling.